Thanks for listening to another episode of DIB Innovators. Today, I have the honor of speaking with Michael Peters, CEO and founder of Lazarus Alliance and Continuum GRC. Michael, thanks for joining today.
Hey, it's my pleasure, David. Glad to be here.
Yeah, this is great. So this is a little bit different than someone directly in the supply chain, someone that's supporting companies so they can do business well. So why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself and how you ended up founding these two companies?
Yeah, two companies. Lazarus Alliance is definitely the older of the two companies that was started to focus on, compliance audits, security audits, assessments, risk assessments. Basically, along the way, we pretty much refined the mission so that it was more like proactive cybersecurity focused. So turn over the rocks before the bad guys find them, right? So, do our work behind the scenes, nice and quiet like, you don't know we're there. And, at the end of the day, nobody's storming your castle and getting in. So that's a good day for our customers. We prefer to stay on the proactive side. So, audit and compliance activities, these days, all the rage is CMMC for the DIB. So we are one of the, on the short list of authorized C3PAOs out there. We've been with that program for years and years before even like Katie Arrington got a hold of it and kind of turned it to what it is now, So, been involved in that respect. But we have a few dozen, probably about 50 compliance programs that we have authorizations or certification body status, things like that. Been around for about 25 years, but like I said, the mission's kind of refined as we went along. So along the way, looking for a way to work smarter, not harder. Quite frankly, between you and I, audit's pretty damn boring. Anything that I can do to make that better, I'm all for it. So, looking for tooling to automate as much as we could to, improve the process, improve security, functionality, cross-functionality. A lot of our customers have multiple compliance programs going on. So, how do you do the work once and use it many times? So that's kind of been a core objective, and couldn't find a tool. One didn't exist. So I set about creating what is today known as Continuum GRC. It was incubated for a few years before in 2015, it was officially launched as a separate company. I still wear too many hats, so CEO to both companies. But hey, 12 hours in the office, that's about right, each day. But anyways, that's kind of how that came about. Continuum is the only FedRAMP authorized, GovRAMP authorized assessment platform out there. I know here recently some compliance-oriented tooling came out, but we're pretty different. We're originally built to support assessors, so like a C3PAO, perfect platform. And then being FedRAMP authorized, of course, is A-OK with the DIB, or DIBCAC. So that's kind of how that came around. We have customers all over the planet supporting, 100-some frameworks. Some really cool automation in there, making our jobs easier. So maybe we'll talk about that later. But anyways, I got into this business, you could say, because of rock and roll. Sounds kind of weird, right? Growing up, I was in college to be an electrical engineer. Kind of thought that's what I wanted to do. I love the techie stuff, but I don't sit still well. And anyways, at the same time, I was also playing in little rock and roll bands, right? Doing performance and stuff. I did get a scholarship to be a tenor, which is kind of strange, right? But
a tenor in what? Choir?
Sure, yeah. Just
okay.
Tenor, choral, right? Anyways, I thought my voice was too nice for rock and roll, so I started smoking cigars at an early age. So I wanted to sound like those old blues men, right?
It's my humidor right over there behind me.
Yeah, and I've got one overhead, one there, one over there. Yeah, it's just that's great. So anyways, that pissed my course director off. She's like, "You're going to destroy your voice." I'm like, I got to sound like, I'm built for rock and roll, man. So anyways, I didn't want to pursue, a chorus in college. I do like the techie stuff, and I didn't think I needed that for playing in a band. So anyways, I decided to join the Air Force. Not like you. I worked for a living. I was enlisted. But anyways, I couldn't take my band with me, so I got my first computer with some sequencing software. Well, being technically inclined, what makes this thing tick? So the hardware, the software, what can I do to it to make it do certain things? And these days we call that hacking. So anyways, I kind of cut my teeth on that, learned about, the platform, and then I got a hold of this thing called the internet. So I was getting into all kinds of places we're not going to talk about online. So, but all for fun, all for fun. And so that's kind of, laid the groundwork for, okay, if I can get into these things, how can I prevent people from getting into them? So that kind of put my mind on that course. A few years later.
So was there a desire to go, I mean, if you can get into things, the mischievous rock and roller in you, was there any pull there? Or you're like, no, I need to go defend.
So, I don't know, you have to balance sort of the natural curiosity, the technical skill, that's kind of required for stuff like that. Oh yeah. That mischievous aspect has always been there since birth, I think. My brother once said something to me that I really appreciated. And he's like, I'm so impressed that you turn your natural tendency for mischief into a business model. Like, yeah, I guess I did. So I thought that was kind of a funny comment. But no, around here we use our powers for good. But it definitely helps to, to be able to, you have to understand your adversary. And if you make twists and turns and contortions and stuff, well, that's what they're doing too. So, it definitely helps to kind of have that mindset.
So you were Air Force, you started poking around, and how did you get kind of into the security? What was your journey into, security side?
Well, you couldn't be at the university anywhere. And, in the IT field, they only had two programs, programming and management. So I leaned towards the programming, and, along the way, you learn different languages and more about IT and stuff. I had a fun project that my professor said couldn't be done. And I did a proof of concept to show him that it could be done. And that was basically to destroy a hard drive with software. So that was kind of entertaining. And it's funny when you kind of outshine the professor. I don't know if you've ever read the laws of power. First law of power is never outshine the master, right? So that's kind of been a challenge along the way, is just, when you think a little differently or whatever, it's sometimes can be scary for other people around you, that don't understand. So, you got to kind of keep that stuff in check, right? But it definitely laid the foundation for what certainly Lazarus Alliance is today. We're experts in finding those problems, and yeah, our bread and butter is probably compliance audits. So, for a lot of companies, that's just checkbox stuff, right? But not to us. I mean, sure, we could accept, easy evidence or something like that, but, doing that would put those companies at risk. And, what does that represent? Well, for me, this is my life's work. So that's the same for them. For those founders, those owners, their employees, their, customers. I mean, it's the whole ecosystem there, that if we don't do our best, well, that puts everyone at risk. So I was just never willing to do that. And when we find things, they'll see something, say something, you've heard that, right? Well, Sometimes that gets pretty interesting with some of the companies that we've worked with. Yeah, sometimes there are like, big internal problems, and it's not external adversaries, it's the devil within, unfortunately. But, if executive leadership doesn't, wants to overlook that, wants to turn the other, turn a blind eye, or they're even part of the problem, well, what are you going to do in a situation like that? Ignore it because, hey, I love the paycheck, or, you're going to try to fix it, which isn't always so easy for you. So anyways, I've had a few interesting experiences along the way that I don't wish on anybody. But at the end of the day, I sleep like a baby at night, man. So
Yeah. So you had a lot of you multiple CISOs or CSOs throughout your journey. Do you think that position of responsibility has shifted from when you were there to now? It's become much more of a bigger deal. Sometimes they're being held personally accountable for problems. How's that landscape shaped, and do you think it's right?
well, when I started, to gain those positions, that experience, CISO wasn't even a position. It really wasn't something that was, widely heard of. Everybody reported it up to the CIO, which is bad in itself. And it was just, you didn't have mentors, who can I talk to, or, what book can I read or something like that. So after I kind of got the hang of that, and I've always, kind of taken a risk-based approach to these things. So that kind of served me well. So along the way, I just, you start creating a security program. So what's that comprised of? Well, governance. What are the policies? What are the laws, the regulations, the rules of the road? Well, to me, that's exactly where it starts. So I have to, articulate in writing, in document policy form, how we do things, how we secure things, what's permissible, what's not. And then the second leg of this, what became what I refer to as the security trifecta. I've written about this. It's a framework that I developed. And so the second leg of this trifecta is technological enforcement. So essentially, okay, what can I engineer to, actively enforce those policies? What can I do technically to enforce the policies? And there are challenges that you can absolutely solve with technology, which is great because those are very unbiased. They don't get tired, they don't get distracted. These are just systems that, yes, no, this rule, not that rule, kind of thing. But then there are plenty of things that are outside of that. So human responsibility comes in play. And that's always, I tell you, it's not the hardware that's the problem. It's the wetware that's the problem, so they're the ones clicking on the ransomware or doing, whatever nonsense, or not paying attention. That's the wetware is always the problem, in my opinion, most of the time. So there's your technical enforcement leg of the trifecta. And then the third leg is all about vigilant teamwork, training, monitoring, investigations, checking things out, keeping your eyes open, stuff like that. So anyways, that's been kind of an interesting journey and challenge to get companies to, to shift towards that. So many are just checkbox, people. It's whatever we need for the compliance audit, and shoot, back when I started, there were almost no compliance audits. There certainly were no certifications for individuals in security. There were no degree plans. I ended up writing about this in a book. I don't know. Shoot, it's probably 15 years ago, maybe now. Securing the sea level. It'll absolutely put you to sleep, I suppose. But it was just sort of articulating this journey and how other people could kind of do the same thing. but it also spoke a lot about the security trifecta. So anyways.
Let me again, so I missed it, just high level, the three legs of your security trifecta.
Yeah, sure. It's governance. So the governance, and policy, that layer. The second layer is technical enforcement. And then the third is vigilant teamwork.
Okay.
So those three key activities, you get that down, yeah, you'll be in good shape for any audit. Your security posture will be, very practical, not a knee-jerk kind of a thing. It's a very deliberate process, and it's not hard. It just takes perseverance.
Hard to do, to get everyone to do, but yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Particularly the C-suite, right? Security is typically viewed as like a cost center, but I tell you, in the earlier days, you had to justify your budgets. Gee, I want to buy this equipment or this software or do this to accomplish some risk, mitigating end. And then it's like, okay, why should we spend money on this? You're just nothing but a cost center. You're not bringing in revenue or anything. Well, anyways, I was going through an MBA program about that time, and there was a formula that I learned. It's called ALE, annualized loss expectancy. And as I was learning this, I was like, damn, I could twist that in a way that the CFO would understand what I'm trying to accomplish here and work like a champ. Absolutely. Work like a champ. So I think if somebody went to my blog, typed in ALE, they'll probably find that reference, and it explains how you calculate it. But anyways, something else to fall asleep on, I'm sure.
But that's true, right? I mean, that's been the challenge, is how do we justify spending on risk reduction? You got to put that in an economic and business case that makes sense. And while logically it may make sense, to not put numbers to it makes it much more challenging.
Yeah, they're not going to fund abstract, right?
Have you seen then a shift in that mentality where security has become more prioritized across all industries?
Oh yeah, 100%. It's a legitimate thing now. CISOs are respectable members of at the boardroom table, right? It used to be a high chair at the big table, but now it's a regular position. I tell you, there's one thing that I'm just like, well, this is crazy. You're killing the messenger. It's a terrible thing that I've seen. And that's where CISOs are being personally liable for security events, breaches and stuff. I mean, including like fines and jail and stuff like that. It's like, holy crap, should the CEO go to jail or get fined if your share prices go down because I don't know, I changed my logo and took, I don't know. Well, Cracker Barrel came to mind right then, but holy cow. I think that is horrible. You want to disincentivize people from, entering the ring, do that. And then what do you have? Okay, nobody's willing, if I defund my police, nobody wants to be a cop. Well, what happens when the robbers come, knocking on my door or knocking down my door or something? What the hell? So what is it? Do we need to devolve into vigilantism, or, it's just crazy.
Yeah, it's not because they have full autonomy. They're being squeezed by the budget, and they're trying to they can't go reduce all risk, so they're trying to reduce the best ones. Without budget, the right budget, it becomes very challenging unless you fund it like Bank of America and put a couple $1 billion at it.
Yeah, but that doesn't solve the problem either.
No, I agree with you. You might be able to justify or shed that from you. That's a great perspective. Shifting a little bit more to defense. You've been dealing with defense contractors for a long time. What's the biggest misconception they have between compliance and security?
Well, I mentioned earlier that most companies, in my opinion, and I've been in audit for like 25 years. So it's, I've seen a few, right? It's the checkbox mentality that if we just follow this framework, that, magically we're not going to have any problems. The problem is that audit and compliance, that's a snapshot in time. There is absolutely no thought or no active, proactive type of a consideration for active threats, the stuff, a 0 day or something like that. If I have an annual compliance program, so yeah, maybe I spend, a couple weeks once a year on my corporate root canal. Well, what about the other 50 weeks in the year? Is this some sort of magical talisman that will protect us? No. So I think that's the big misconception. So, you can do all that work, and it's great for visibility, for pointing out, flaws, short gaps, what have you. Totally love it, and I built a business around it. But without that, a lot of companies do nothing, and that's even worse, right? So at least this has a tendency to bring visibility, into the arena. And when when my team is, we're doing these audits, frequently customers will talk about doing a separate gap assessment. I mean, that's great, but gap, it's essentially inherent to an actual audit. I mean, you can do these things simultaneously, which creates efficiencies and cost benefits for certainly your customer. But, if I see something, gee, that whatever, you don't have multi-factor or whatever the case is, I can point that out to my customer and then continue on with the rest of what we're doing and allow them to figure out how they want to close that gap. And then we can retest it, so it takes a little bit of extra time. They see a little bump in the invoice, big deal, but we're able to be much more efficient. And then the other thing that we try to improve upon here is more of, you can look at it like the Kanban, the continuous monitoring. That's something that we promote with 100% of our customers. So to give you an example of that, traditional audit firms, they'll descend on your organization and consume a couple of weeks of your, full 40 hours a week kind of a thing, doing these audits. And then you won't see them for the rest of the year. What we like to do is break that up throughout the year. So every month, a couple of hours a month, we meet with the customer, we go over a few controls, we collect some evidence, and then at the end of the annual cycle, a few things have occurred. Number one, we've stayed in touch, in tune with our customer for the full year. So as they have things that change, those get identified early. So they can maybe that gets baked into next year's program. So, they start walking the walk, collecting evidence and demonstrating things. And we can weigh in on that. Oh, that's great. We'll take notes and we'll bake that in for next year. Or holy cow, you guys are gonna, go off the rails or something. So we can advise, we see changes closer to real time versus on an annual basis. And then also what's great is sample size dramatically increases. I mean, traditional sample size for assessments is like 10%, right, of a population. Well, in my opinion, that's about 90% room for error, right? So, I mean, the reason that's done is because it's impossible almost to look at that freaking haystack and looking for all the little needles in it, and to do that in a week or 2 weeks even. It's just, now maybe that's better now with AI tools, but the point is to find problems before they become problems. So, by spreading this out throughout the year, we improve that. So
Yeah, I think that's a great point. CMMCs, the div is interesting because they're coming to companies who have never done anything.
right.
You need to go through a readiness process. But once you're compliant, you obtain your audit. It would behoove you to continue then, operationalize that over time. And I fear, I don't fear it, but the natural tendency will be for companies to knock that out, then do their self-assessment, and then scramble for 9 to 10 months to a year to fix everything that they failed to do correctly along the way. So it's that journey, which over time will probably save you money, effort, make you more efficient and more secure. So couldn't agree more. When you look at like security, so I'd say proactive, but not really on the compliance side, but like actually defending networks, monitoring, my impression is there's a lot of snake oil out there. Companies, oh, we do 24/7. But you've got, let's say MSPs or other providers that the better they do, because it's such a human-centric operation, the more work, the more people they have to put to it, the more dollars they spend and reduce their margins. And so they're incentivized to say, oh, we took care of that. They maybe they saw that there was a phishing. Microsoft said it was good and didn't do the next step of like, well, did anyone else get it? Did anyone else not stop there by the time it was quarantined? How do you sort through, from your perspective on the assessment side, like what's good?
Well, I tend to not be so product focused for one. It's kind of like what's the objective? What are we trying to do here? And from a risk focused perspective, what's most important? It's data, right? My customers' data. My recipe to the secret sauce. Whatever it is that is most important to that organization, and that's essentially data. I mean, maybe you're a machine shop or something like that. So, your data looks a little bit differently, but hey, I've got CNC machines, Whirl-and-Way, blueprints, engineering diagrams and stuff, customer records. I don't know. I've spent time in machine shops, got my hand on that equipment, have some experience there. It's not, people don't think that it's necessarily high tech, but there is actually quite a reliance on data per se. So anyways, back to the risk focused perspective. Okay, so if it's really about data, so start peeling that onion back, man. How am I protecting it? What network controls, endpoint controls, monitoring, rules and things like that. A crazy example for me, and here's something I wrote about probably, I don't know, decade or more ago. But, when malware, like email-borne malware became, started to, hit the scenes, I think that was part of what the I love you virus at the end of the 90s or something. I think that was probably when it really started. But anyways, what was crazy to me was, that remote command and control malware, it needs to phone home. It relies on network protocols to do this. And, and you see all these vendors with, oh, we got, we're catching, all this stuff. And, we've put your endpoint, monitoring on and your network monitoring. And you had to invest a lot in gear and people and stuff like that. And, too super easy. I won't say free because it takes some labor to configure it, but free in that it pretty much comes standard, right? So anyways, one is internal DNS, secure DNS. To me, it's why is this still not a thing in preventing, some of the ransomware and stuff like that? If this software cannot communicate with the mothership, it's done. It's quarantined. Then you can resolve it without it spreading everywhere and getting worse. So, I mean, there's things like that. Simple firewall rules. I had a customer. Actually, it was first a customer, and then they hired me on to be a CISO. But they had something called the Loki virus, and their system administrator put it in the organization on purpose. And this dude was just, I don't know, It's one of these guys one of these angry guys, And anyways, there's a remote command and control port that this thing needed. And I just blocked that port at the firewall. End of story, man. Your little fun and games here, you're not going to get anywhere with it. Now, it took a few weeks for the help desk to disinfect the entire organization, but it didn't go down. It wasn't destroyed, with a few key clicks. And it didn't take any sophisticated technology to do this. This was a firewall rule. This was basic knowledge of network protocol sniffing, network analysis. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. Tools are great because they make things, hard things more accessible, easier to implement, perhaps. So there is definitely value in that. Don't get me wrong.
Well, from SMB standpoint, though, what you're talking about is expertise.
Yeah.
And we both know that there is not a lot of it compared to the demand. And so you will find yourself outsourcing, ideally not risk, but oftentimes that is outsourced, as well as the capability. So I think that's where we see more what I was talking about of, smaller companies that can't afford to bring in one, two, three people, or choose not to. I mean, those are obviously choices, but
I'm just curious. Last I knew, there was like 1 million vacancies, right?
Yeah, it's something ridiculous. And that's not even vacancies, but those are vacancies that are actively, I think, being looked at for. I don't think that includes companies, a 50-person company that doesn't have that on its docket, an aerospace company.
Absolutely. I'm just curious what the numbers say. 3.5 million unfilled cybersecurity positions projected in 2025. Holy cow. Last I checked, it was 1 million.
Yeah,
anyway.
So that's a problem. To your point, yes, there are things to do, but you don't have the expertise, the professionals, the knowledge, the wherewithal, and the ability to bring that capability to a large majority. And probably most of those are smaller companies, but many of those aren't even posted for security jobs.
Yeah.
They've got the chief engineer or one of their engineers picking up security rules. Yeah, it's a challenge. On the CMMC side, right now, I think the latest number was 115 or something like that. 1,000 companies need to be CMMC level 2. Obviously, but like your perspective, that's going to be a challenge from the government side of there aren't that many C3PAOs. How do you think this is going to get resolved, and where does this go? Because there's also, for a company that's invested literally nothing into security, to carve out a chunk of money to go do this. How do you see this playing out?
I may not be making friends with my opinion here, but can't help myself.
That's what we're here for, open, honest dialogue.
I think there's a fundamental problem with the program, a couple of problems. First off, the government keeps waffling on the mandate, right? Which
it's become less, right? Because 48 CFR came down, so I think there's less. Correct me if I'm wrong. Unless you're hearing on top of that, there's even more waffling.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the 800 171, that was supposed to be mandatory. 5 years ago, I think they set the date. We're 3.5 years into CMMC land, and which is supposed to make everything great. And they're still playing around, moving dates and stuff. I mean, every time we check, a piece and part still get, they kick the can down the street, more. So, or again, so that's a problem. I mean, yeah, I totally get implementation costs, things like that. It's a big ecosystem, so it's not a simple thing. It's kind of like the boy who cries wolf. The DoD, or the Department of War now, I like that better. That, oh yeah, it's mandatory. You need to do this, and it's going to happen. And oh yeah, it's still going to happen. They keep on saying it and saying it and saying it. Okay. Do I believe what they're saying, or maybe, oh yeah, they're probably still a cluster over there. So I've got more time despite what they're saying. So I'm going to just delay this expense and things like that. It's it's a combination of things that do not help. Doesn't help anyone. Now, to make matters worse, when the DoD outsourced the compliance program, first they turned it loose with a bunch of private interests, like this feeding frenzy, get rich quick scheme started brewing, and all of these self-interests got, started to formulate what today is the cyber AB. And, that kind of got a little bit better, because there was a lot of legitimate problems and complaints and stuff like that, with conflict of interest and stuff like that. Totally right. So we had to suffer through that bullshit. From my perspective as a C3PAO, I don't know if you've looked at the fees associated with being in this program. They are pretty substantial, and it is a barrier to entry for little companies, startups and stuff. Absolutely a barrier. But now, here's the part that is even worse, in my opinion: the fact that I have to have 3 CCAs on every customer project, and the only source for training and certification is the same organization that tells me I have to have them, right? How is that not a conflict of interest? So anyways, so I have the foxes guarding the hen house, and, they're the sole source for this. And I know they try to hide behind Keiko, that's an independent nonprofit organization. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so you got that problem. Why do I need 3 CCAs on a project? I need at least one for professional oversight. Me personally, I never have a customer audit without 2 auditors on it. And that's largely for continuity with the customer, as well as our own sort of peer review. So it's a quality control thing. And, I want to make sure that my people are delivering on our promises to our customer and they're doing the right thing, because people get lazy. They cut corners. I don't need that. Not on my watch, man. So anyways, so I've got all this overhead. It cost me about $9,000 to certify one person. So, great. Now I've got $27,000 to get the minimum team assembled. Holy crap, Anyways, no wonder there's such a shortage in this, because the requirements are such and the costs are super high. Now, when I get that team together and then I run them through, run the customer through, then I have additional fees for the certification. So all of this money is going towards the cyber AB to administer this program. I mean, we're also a FedRAMP 3 PAO. Not that I have any great admiration or love for the FedRAMP program in itself, but in contrast, my assessors have to possess certain industry recognized certifications, like a CISSP as an example. Who in the world outside of the CMMC ecosystem gives a shit about CCAs? It's not transferable anywhere else. So, it's this own little self-licking ice cream cone, scenario that we have over here. That's a big problem. It's also costing our customers much more. As soon as that mandate came out last year for 3 CCAs, our audits dramatically increased in cost. I got to support that beast, right? Which means that now my customers pay more than they should. And so anyways, that's a problem. Who ultimately pays for that? Well, it gets passed through to the DoD and then the taxpayers. So
that's assuming a small business can cover it until they get under a contract of program of record where they can expense it.
Yeah, exactly, 100%. So that's a problem, of course. But in contrast, the FedRAMP program, my organization has to be a 3PAO, so similar to a C3PAO. You'd think that those programs would be reciprocal. Nope. That takes away their cheddar, right? So that's a problem. They have to be annually examined, but they have to have industry certs. And then, they undergo, we just as an organization, last week we went through a few days of the A2LA, which is, a private organization similar to the Cyber AB. They're sole source for the government to do FedRAMP 3PAO accreditation. But we have reasonable fees, no special certifications, industry certs that everybody recognizes, and then we get tested. Fabulous, challenge accepted. And it's not egregious costs, so we don't have to pass that on to our customers in a big way. Of course, we do a little bit, but it's not to the extreme that the CMMC program has. So anyways, I don't know. I've said a lot.
Well, that was a lot of what's wrong, and I wouldn't agree with you. I think it was a great summary. Where does this end up?
Well, there is some activity in the background, through congressional channels and things like that, that may rectify some of this impartiality issue, that in some of the requirements, like the 3CCA rule, that's just bloat that does nobody any good. And, also stretches the marketplace. There's not enough. Whenever that deluge of the DIB come running for their level 2s, well, I'll love to have that problem. I'd love to have such a backlog and our prices go up. Sure, great, but why do we have to even go there? We shouldn't. We should do this sensibly. So I do think the government needs to wrangle this program. And now, I suppose in the grand scheme of things, Doge and all that kind of stuff, well, this is probably small potatoes, right? So it probably isn't getting much attention. But, that's something that I think, really needs to happen, just responsibly needs to happen. I know there was talk about allowing foreign-owned companies into this program, which I think is an absolute national security problem waiting to happen. I know for a fact that there are some behind-the-scenes congressional things going on there. Don't ask me how I know this. So I'm hoping that kind of gets headed off before it becomes a problem. Plus it also competes with American companies. So I think that's wrong and great. Now I have, some Asian company that's doing this. No offense to the Asians, but it's always about the race to the bottom, man. So, with national security, we sure shit don't need that. So that's just a problem that's brewing. I don't know, man. I feel like I'm being more negative than I am positive.
Oh, I'm asking tough questions. These are good. Companies need to take it serious, I think. We also need, I think the first time a prime loses a $20+ million contract as one of their suppliers is not, that will change the dynamic significantly. Mm-hmm. If companies just go, this is the cost of doing business, it is what it is, and that's what compliance does drive. It drives budget. That'll just be baked in. So I think that's what's going to, it's going to take, I think, someone getting shot in the face that has has meaningful authority, not just a small company that misses out, but a prime loses a deal because of it. That would send a message pretty quickly.
Yeah, you're right about that for sure. I used to, these days I'm more busy, more occupied with running a company than I am in the trenches. I'm really not in the trenches anymore, as you'd expect. But when I was, I would always tell my customers, blame me, audit says we have to do this. So I guess we have to do this, so helps them justify their budgets or the changes that they want. So, use it. So compliance is a driver. So
yeah, absolutely. So for you guys, you've got a platform, you've got, your auditing capability. So there's just going to be this onslaught, right? For the next 3 to 5 years, I'm guessing. You can tell me if you think your time frame's different.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah. But then everything's going to be kind of set in stone. Do you think that market's going to continue to, this is pretty greenfield right now, hence all the people trying to get rich quick. That will normalize. Do you think the security standards in the DIB will go higher? It continue to increase. Right now, they're pretty general. They're good. They're great. It's a very starting point. But
well, the 800-171 by itself, and we see a lot of this with customers. Hey, there's only 110 security controls that I have to answer to, and here's a half-baked paragraph, fragmented paragraph, spelling grammar errors, crap like that. This'll do, right? Well, no, actually, no, that won't do. And oh, by the way, this maps back to the 853. Love the 853, man. And it's absolutely easy to follow, easy to understand. It's a beast. It is the bloody mother of all frameworks as far as we're concerned. And on the Continuum side, it is the keystone framework, we refer to it as. But when we do our auto mapping, where we build a new standard in the platform, we do the cross mapping. We used to try to rely on the different agencies for mapping. No, this must be super boring to these people because they do a shit job. It's just too granular. And so anyways, we do the hard work. We've got close to 3 million data points in our database for auto mapping between standards, 100 plus standards. It's a beast, but you do that work so customers don't have to. So anyways, that needs to be better defined. Great, you've got your 171 standard, but never mind with this 110 superficial thing. That's misleading. That's confusing. Just stick to the bloody 853, derivative, the subset, go with that. So I think that should change. Now, why the cyber AV in its infinite wisdom? Here I am making friends again. I know that's sarcastic. Why they decided to model the CMMC program on an ISO certification cycle, so every 3 years. Now, the funny thing is they did that, whereas with ISO, now Lazarus Alliance is a certification body in a raft of ISOs as well. The first year is the full audit. The second and third year are what's known as surveillance audits. So you can kind of consider them halvesies, if you will. Better than nothing, but at least, you're kind of checking things. Now, they haven't really structured that with CMMC. It's just like the first year, and then 3 years later, you do it all over again. Well, like nothing can go wrong in that 3-year cycle. I don't know why that's even a thing. I mean, all other audits are annually based, which is better for sure. Continuous monitoring, even better. So, we're talking the DIB here. We're talking national security. There's a reason why we see Chinese aircraft that look a lot like American aircraft. How do you think that happened, big boys? So anyways, I don't know. We could definitely go down that rabbit hole. But back to the core CMMC question, that should be improved. I think it's definitely going to be improved. And also with Rev 3 of the 171, it actually looks like it's heading in that direction, which I love. So hopefully that is what it looks to be, what I think it is.
Yeah, I think that's great, because I do think it'll change. It'll be interesting to watch. But unfortunately, I've got to wrap this up. Michael, it's been fun. I mean, what great stories and perspectives. So thank you for your time. If people want to get a hold of you, need help with certifying their company, how best to do that?
Well, LazarusAlliance.com is the audit and compliance firm. ContinuumGRC.com is the platform. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn, and both companies are there under my profile. Not hard to find. So anyways, we'll look forward to helping people. Anyways, been a pleasure, David. Thanks so much. Next time you're in Scottsdale, let's have a scotch.
Let's do it. All right. Well, thank you, Michael.